Okay, so today, as the title implies, I'm here to talk about R&D and innovation policy, and I want to present a little different view of how innovation occurs or has occurred in Canada. As we had a bit of a discussion in the last panel, I view innovation as not the straightforward outcome of free trade or of the application of free market economics, as is often the way it is portrayed in a lot of economic theory, but as something which is deeply contested and is the outcome of social and political conditions in a way that is much broader than the way in which innovation is commonly presented. So today, I'm going to go through a bit of a history of Canadian government policy and the impact and the development of innovation in Canada. I'll just start with this quote to show that innovation remains a priority part of the federal government agenda. Jeffrey Simpson in the Globe and Mail from Wednesday, February 17, 2016, states the Trudeau government is very keen to promote innovation in the Canadian economy, especially high technology, to prepare the country for what is called the fourth industrial revolution. And this is a term that is being used a lot these days, coming out of this notion that the fourth industrial revolution is going to come out of artificial intelligence, AI, and the sweeping technological changes that are coming out of the development of all of these digital technologies. You're getting books coming out about robotization, all of which are forms of digital programming that will allow people to be replaced by machines. So that's one aspect of the fourth revolution. This whole notion that through digitization we can have massive changes in the economy. And so for the government, this is a core interest. Now, I want to just provide some background. First of all, I'm going to start with R&D and innovation after 1945, because this was a key period when R&D and innovation changed in the advanced capitalist world. There was a major burst of development in that area. So the Trudeau government goal is not new, but is part of a long history of focus by both Canada and other OECD states in this area, where they have consistently poured resources, large amounts of money, large amounts of focus in promoting innovation within their domestic economies. And this was a major area of growth after 1945. You had a higher R&D and innovation in the post-war Fordist boom, which was from 1945 to the early 1970s, through public and private investment. Now, the post-war Fordist boom refers to that whole period in advanced capitalism when you had the development in Europe, in Japan, of extensive mass production, mass consumption industry. And this is the period when those images that in the advertising, to speak to some of the earlier talks, you have the images of particularly women in the home promoting ever more elaborate home processes with refrigerators and dishwashers and all the other paraphernalia of consumption that was being consistently promoted. Well, underneath all of that was a whole set of new forms of R&D which were developing all these new forms of mass consumption articles. Now, in the U.S., you had a veritable explosion of R&D. If you look at graphs on R&D spending in the U.S. after 1945, you see an exponential growth curve. And that was very much funded by military spending, as well as spending on the National Institutes of Health. So the federal state, or the U.S. central state, was funding an enormous increase in R&D and U.S. private industry was also doing that as well. And there were a lot of spin-offs. So you had a lot of spin-offs from military R&D in the U.S. to areas like the internet, computers, of course chemicals, a lot of the chemicals that were used in the Vietnam War became part of what Dow Chemical and other chemical companies were using for civilian applications. So there was this big growth, and you had major new original innovative capacities in Western Europe and Japan that were developing at the same time. This focus on R&D and innovation continued under neoliberal restructuring after the Fordist period, and in some ways it grew. And in particular, you had a growth of what is called research-intensive machinery and fabricated metal products sector from the 1970s to the 1990s. This encompasses the major growth in areas like ICT, information and communications technologies. All of those technologies that we can come to take for granted now. This was the period from the 1970s to the 1990s when there was this expansion and where you began to see advanced capitalist economies shift their orientation away from traditional areas of manufacturing, which are concentrated now in the global south. So there was a major shift in where manufacturing industry was located between the global north and the global south. And as part of this shift, you have a rising, what is called GER to GDP ratio over time. What that refers to is the gross expenditure in R&D as a proportion of GDP, gross domestic product. And this impact was recognized by all the advanced capitalist states in the period, in the neoliberal period, and you had a rising focus by these states on what is called liberal productivist strategies. And what was meant by that is that you had a shift away from the Keynesianism of the post-Second World War period, where the focus of states was on growing employment through Keynesian aggregate demand strategies, to a focus on boosting R&D and boosting innovation within economies so that they could be more competitive in the world economy. And that was the way in which employment growth was going to be stimulated. So you had a range of programs and policies developed by OECD states over the last decades of the 20th century, using subsidies and various tools to promote technological restructuring. One of the areas that has tended to be ignored in a lot of the work, particularly by political scientists, who have tended to focus on welfare state spending, have tended to focus on military spending, is they tended to neglect the area of R&D and technology. And that is an area where actually states have been boosting their spending in a very rapid way while cutting back in other areas. And we see this even in the face of the rising government deficits that occurred after the crisis in 2008-09, when you had the meltdown, or the potential meltdown, of the global economy after the subprime mortgage crisis in the U.S., when governments began to cut back on their spending through austerity cuts. We find stable or increasing ratio of outlays for R&D as a proportion of GDP. Now, in the case of Canada, we have divergent patterns. The Canadian federal state followed the general trend and actively promoted R&D and original innovation from the early 1960s onwards. So there was a whole focus that over a 40-year period in which new government programs and new forms of support for industry were being developed in the area. Despite these efforts and the fact that a key objective of all these government programs was to boost the relative standing of Canadian industry. The whole objective was to increase the ability of Canadian industry through R&D and innovation to create greater exports and improve its competitive position in the world economy. Despite that objective, it failed. Canadian industry remained at the bottom of the advanced economies in some important metrics. Now, I want to just quickly go over how this pattern worked itself out. The gap was established in the post-war Fordist period, particularly with the U.S., when Canadian industry relied heavily on technological borrowing. There was a consistent pattern where Canadian industry has historically not invested in its own R&D and original innovation, but has relied on technological borrowing from companies, particularly in the U.S. In doing this, it followed the same pattern as in the latter part of the 19th century and early 20th century, when Canadian industry industrialized rapidly using American technologies as part of Canada being the first economy outside of the U.S. to adopt Fordist, Taylorist production processes systematically. So there was a whole way in which the Canadian economy, and I argue in my book, Asleep at the Switch, where it was, in a way, unique in the advanced capitalist world in the early 20th century in using American Fordist processes. I argue that American Fordist processes only came to be applied systematically in other parts of the capitalist world after the Second World War, when you had the development of new Fordist approaches in Western Europe under U.S. leadership, where you had all kinds of productivity councils that were established between American and European industry, and in Japan, where there was a systematic process of adapting American processes to their production. U.S. R&D rose dramatically after 1945, while Canadian R&D grew to a far lesser extent. But the gap grew with a variety of countries besides the U.S. Just as a matter of some figures here to give you the dimensions of how Canada relied on technological borrowing. In the 1960s, 95% of patents were owned outside of Canada, and 2/3 of those patents were registered to U.S. residents. Among 25 countries, Canada had the highest percentage of patents owned outside the country and the lowest percentage of patents owned by Canadian residents. Canada also ranked last among 10 leading economies in a composite index of 4 performance indicators covering the location of 100 significant innovations since 1945, monetary receipts for patents, 1963-64, number of patents taken out in foreign countries, 1963, and export performance in research-intensive product groups, 1963-65. Now we find, despite all of the attention that has been placed on this area by the federal state, and indeed by provincial governments as well, that the pattern did not change under neoliberalism and under free trade agreements. And this is an interesting point. As we saw in the previous panel, one of the key justifications for free trade, especially in the Canadian context, was that by increasing competitive pressures, by removing tariff protections, as was talked about in the previous panel, the Canadian economy was under what were called the national policy tariffs from 1867 onwards, 1879 onwards, and only became dismantled over the 70s and 80s. Despite that, we see no change. Even though tariffs were removed, competitive pressures were increased in the Canadian economy, we in fact had the reverse impact. Far from R&D and innovation becoming a greater focus on the part of Canadian industry, it declined. So I've shown here how BERD, business enterprise R&D, as a percentage of GDP, gross domestic product, declined consistently after 2000, from 1.13, 76% of the OECD average, to 0.82, 50.9% of the OECD average in 2013. That's a massive shift in which they went from over 3/4 of the OECD average to just above half in a period of 13 years. And this reflected declines in research-intensive sectors of the Canadian economy consistently. So if we look at R&D expenditures in the first decade of the 21st century, from 2000 and 2010, in the area of electronics, a massive decline, especially after Nortel went under. If we look at pharmaceuticals, another massive decline. If we look at instruments, scientific instruments, massive decline. So you have a consistent pattern where in these key areas, matching with that decline in R&D, you have deteriorating trade balances, falling export shares in all the research-intensive sectors of electronics, office machinery and computers, pharmaceuticals and instruments between 2002 and 2011. Various reviews show relatively lower performance in various indicators as well, such as manufacturing value added in research-intensive sectors, patents, venture capital funding of innovation, etc. So this is a broad pattern. So that raises the question, why did this happen? How did we end up in this situation, despite the fact that there were so many promises that free trade would improve this area of the Canadian economy? Well, as I say here, contrary to interpretations which stress lack of competitive context, tariff-protected Canadian industry was more at the forefront of new technologies in the early 20th century and in the mid-20th century, when it was able to catch up and integrate primarily American technologies into production. So there was a whole way in which, with tariffs, American transnational capital would create branch plants in Canada, would transfer its technologies to the Canadian context, and there would be a whole process of catching up. And this continued through the middle part of the 20th century. But this changes with the new neoliberal period of economic opening, when there was this systematic reduction of tariffs. American capital no longer invests in the same way in branch plants in new areas of production. It serves the Canadian market through exports, either through its home bases or production sites meeting NAFTA content rules. And this is particularly clear with ICT products. That whole new range of products that are being developed in the U.S. And that are being established in these various home bases in Silicon Valley and in the area around Massachusetts and in other areas of the American economy, you do not get this pattern that previously existed where American companies would establish Canadian versions. Instead, that kind of branch plant investment no longer happens. And it's also, it cannot be seen as a result of failing to follow the innovation systems approach. This is a whole body of literature called the National Systems of Innovation literature, which argues that you develop more innovation-based economy through developing a systematic form of clustering of innovations and home bases. And this, of course, was very influential in Ottawa in the 80s and 90s when they followed this strategy quite systematically. That did not change the major deterioration that I just pointed to. Rather, I would argue that we need to focus on the long process of contestation that has occurred in Canada around industrial strategy and around how our economy should be constructed. And this was a process of contestation from the 1960s to the turn of the 20th century, a 40-year period, when various governments at the federal level debated industrial strategies. People are not aware of the extent to which, and I detail this in my book, Asleep at the Switch, the extent to which within, especially liberal governments, there was a systematic process of debate about how the Canadian economy should be transformed. From the 1960s onward, government bureaucrats in the Department of Industry, Trade and Commerce were well aware that the Canadian economy was deficient and weak in terms of its R&D and innovation capacities, and were proposing strategies to change it. And there was a long process of debate about how that should be done. However, nationalist strategies, and in this sense, nationalist strategies do not necessarily imply protectionism, but imply a systematic way of boosting innovation capacities over a period of time, because they are not instantaneous in terms of responding to price changes. Nationalist strategies that promoted more systematic interventions to change underlying sources of low R&D, particularly as the Canadian economy was opened up to free trade, lost out to business forces and their representatives at the federal level, who argued systematically, along the lines of people in the previous panel, that those kinds of government interventions were counterproductive, could not change the situation, and that the best way to approach industrial strategy was to rely on free trade agreements and the free flow of markets. So I would argue then, in conclusion, that we need to look at how government strategies were based to a much greater extent on what are called market-driven strategies, in which federal support was focused in tax incentives. Canada provides the highest level of support in terms of tax subsidies of any advanced capitalist economy, and forms of partnership with private capital in order to create more market-driven R&D. I'll just end, because I've come to the end of my time, by saying the underlying sources of low R&D could not be overcome by the general forms of assistance provided by tax incentives and programs relying on private capital to take up opportunities, such as the federal make-or-buy policy or the centers of networks of excellence. Canada did not follow national industrial strategies, as occurred in some Asian economies, because of a particular configuration of political economic conditions which stopped it from restructuring its economy. So in this regard, I'm calling for people to look at the evolution of the Canadian economy as more the result of political economic contestation and internal sources of division than a sort of natural unfolding of market forces. Thank you.